Hello everybody, I'm Audrey. Quite a few people know me, I know a lot of people in the room. We set up Suffolk Law Centre last year out of ISCRE, but I've been with ISCRE since 2006 and been involved in stop and search since about 2010 or so. Quick advert, my project, which is called Tackling Discrimination in the East, is funded by the National Lottery, and they are paying for some of the costs of this conference, so thanks very much to them, because I'm going to talk about the link between stop and search and discrimination. Anyway, as you heard before, the Stop and Search research group, reference group, really came out of some research that we did back in 2008 at ISCRE. One of my colleagues called Nancy was embedded for a period at Suffolk Police to look at whether some of the myths, as we found them to be, which the police were using to justify the disproportionality, had any merit, because it was impacting on decision making. There'd been quite a high profile murder at a nightclub called Zest, and there was a lot of talk about drug dealers and people involved in rap music coming up and having fights, and that was some of the justification for the disproportionality in stop and search. We also had a situation where Nancy was there. An officer was overheard to say, when he was talking about there was migration of migrants from Ipswich to Peter at the time, was heard to say, good, let them all move because there are too many of them in Suffolk. When he was challenged, he said he knew he wasn't being politically correct. Now, slightly foolishly, Samuel and I were at a meeting a couple of years later, and slightly foolishly, we were given, by accident, a report of some feedback from officers who'd been at a meeting about stop and search and how it's done in Suffolk. And basically the consensus was, if it wasn't for those pesky people at ISCRE, then we'd be able to sort out crime in Suffolk, or words to that effect. I mean, I felt, it was a bit Scooby-Doo-like that we were the pesky people who were stopping them from doing what they can do. But the reality of the situation was that we were the bogeyman who were stopping police officers from doing everything to sort out crime. I think the relationship has got a lot better since. I mean, we did have to threaten to judicially review Suffolk Police in 2012 when they said that they were not going to support the Stop and Search reference group financially. But that was overcome. We had a little demo, as well as threatening you legally, we had a little demo at your headquarters.
Before my time.
Before your time.
Yeah.
But hey, I think it has improved a lot. We set up the Stop and Search reference group. Stop and Search, it's generally mostly for the suspicion of cannabis. Suffolk Police do stop for suspicion of cannabis. They don't stop for smell only, but smell only plus something else is stopped for. But you also need to know that mostly nothing is found. As a success rate, it's pretty low. There are some positives to stop and search. I think I've got this seesaw wrong. But anyway, positives. Generally, the public, most of whom aren't subject to stop and search, think it's a great thing. 13% of stops and searches have a positive outcome, I guess. The negatives are that there's little evidence that stop and search deters criminal behaviour. A lot more evidence about that than any positive impact with regard to criminal behaviour. And it's slightly concerning that something with such little evidence is supported so strongly by a lot of senior police officers nationally. It also has a massive effect on community relations. The evidence shows that it not only causes a reduction in effective intelligence, but also there's a huge negative impact on police recruitment levels of black and minority ethnic people to the police force. If you've been stopped several times, why would you want to join an organisation? Why would you trust them? It's given the fact that Suffolk has got very few. I think, every black officer in Suffolk, and I shouldn't be able to know every black officer in Suffolk. Your numbers are so low, and that's something that really has to change. We have a service level agreement with Suffolk Police, so what happens basically is there's a man over there, Roger, Inspector Roger Salmon sends me a database of all the stops and searches anonymised over a period of about 2 to 3 months. And we do a dip sample. I look at 10% of white British people and 30% of all other groups. Now, that choice of how many to dip sample was our choice, because when I did some looking around the police forces nationally, amazingly, they hadn't thought about what constitutes a good dip sample for statistical purposes. And I looked at, like, Dorset Police look at about 10 stops and searches every 6 months. And they amazingly find that the 10 are usually white British people, and therefore they decide that there's no problem with their, despite the fact their disproportionality is the worst in the country. In practice, I do that number because I think it gives me a better idea of the impact it has on people other than white British people, but still looking at what happens to white British people. I look at between about 30 and 100 every time, and I do it usually with one of my volunteers, law students or law graduates. We make brief comments on the form, and we send it back to the police. I look at legality, so whether it's legal, whether there are reasonable grounds of suspicion, and I also look at the issue of disproportionality. Is there any evidence that points me into why there is a disproportionality, more stops regarding black people than white people? And we then get answers from the police on those issues, and regardless of what the answers to the police are, we then bring 6 to 10 examples of such stop and searches to a public meeting which anybody can attend every 2 months. Right, you won't be able to read this, but this is actually what it looks like, and actually unfortunately it's not come out terribly well. But that's the sort of thing I look at. Now, I haven't got a stop and search form with me, but there is on the front of it something called reasonable grounds of suspicion, and that should be given to the person who is being stopped. They should know why they've been stopped. Now, these days it's all about receipts and you can go to a police station and whatever, but the point about it is, in legal terms, what is written on the front of that form in the reasonable, the grounds for stopping somebody should constitute that reason, and I don't look at anything else. I don't rely on what the police then tell me, or the fact that they've got long history of criminality previously. All those things are irrelevant. It should be what they tell me on the form. Right, examples. This is an early one, and Roger's heard this a lot. We got a form that said the grounds for stopping somebody was black man seen in village. Okay? Now, hopefully there's nobody in this room that thinks that's reasonable grounds of suspicion. But it also tells you a lot about Suffolk. You know, in practice, unfortunately, 10 years ago, that was not uncommon. And in practice, you obviously appreciate it's not only not reasonable grounds of suspicion, it's also fairly good evidence of racial discrimination. I'm a discrimination lawyer, so this sort of thing is really interesting. More recently, now I haven't taken this one because it's a really, really bad example. It's actually quite a typical example, but it does raise concerns with me. So it said, male detained for Section 1 pace search, that's a normal search on reasonable ground, after being identified as being part of a group relating to gangs in or around a particular park. Recent reliable information confirmed this. Male would not provide his details to the police. Search was negative. Male stopped in area where antisocial behaviour and recent weapons offences have taken place. Now, in practice, being identified as part of a group relating to gangs. In practice, I know from the guidelines that being identified as a reasonable part of a gang, unless you're wearing gang colours, can't constitute reasonable suspicion. Okay? So that bit concerns me. And also, a group relating to gangs in and around X Park, usually in this town, in Ipswich, means you probably went to school with somebody who happens to be in a gang, rather than you are a fully paid up member of J Block or something. I don't know if J Block's got membership cards, but hey. Right, male would not provide his details to police. There is no requirement to do so. Male stopped in an area where antisocial behaviour and recent weapon offences have taken place. What constitutes an area? In practice, we found out that a drugs area was Ipswich railway station. So a man running to Ipswich railway station was deemed to be in a drugs area. These things concern me. In practice, these are the sorts of stops and searches that our group would have concerns about. It's interesting actually because we've done quite a lot of work over the times and we've been saying things like, you know, it's not good enough just to say we've got intelligence. How recent, how reliable is the intelligence? And I do worry sometimes that we're just giving the words to help people to overcome some kind of line of it's okay if the underlying thinking is still discriminatory. But in practice, that's the sort of thing we discuss. We feed back to the police, because I suspect, hand on heart, if I showed that to a bunch of police officers at Martlesham in a training event, they wouldn't have any concerns about that. Whereas I, as a discrimination lawyer, have a lot of concerns about that sort of situation. And so the question has to be, who's right? And I think it's a moving target. Right, so regular concerns. Unconscious bias being evidenced in language used for reasonable suspicion. Okay, so use of bus terms. These are the ones. Drugs hotspots. What is a drugs hotspot? Is it an alleyway that's always been used for drugs? That's probably okay. Or is it the whole of West Ipswich, which is not? Area known for. Yeah? That means that if you happen to have been born in a street that's poor, deprived, etc., then you're going to get stopped and searched because you're in an area known for. Urban. Really hate that phrase. Oh, hood pulled up. We had this. This chap in Lowestoft was stopped in the middle of the night in winter, and they said that one of the grounds of suspicion was his hood was pulled up, and we were all in the group saying, well, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the night, wouldn't your hood be pulled up? So yeah, person known to the police. In practice, at what point are you allowed to stop being a criminal and lead a law-abiding life without being stopped and searched, if you see what I mean? You know, the fact that you've got convictions in the past is not an indicator that you are currently committing offences, and reasonable suspicion has to be about the fact you're committing an offence on that occasion, not that in the past you were a naughty person. Reference, oh, not local. Yeah, don't like that one. How come not local people aren't criminals and not local? References to nationality as a sole identity, i.e. two Romanians, if the informant is not close or knowledgeable enough to know the Romanian language. And we're getting that more as our population of Romanians increases. Yeah? It's usually coupled with, Romanians, they're the ones who are into pickpocketing or sexual assaults and stuff. And it's like, hang on, that's stereotyping. We have to know that these individual people are the ones committing the offences, not you happen to come from an entire country in Eastern Europe. Risk of reliance on what might be malicious allegations by the police. Rachel, you touched on that. It's a real concern to us. In practice, we get, if a member of the public rings up and says, I think there's a black man dealing in the, there needs to be discussion about precise descriptions that don't just rely on their colour. Yeah? There needs to be discussions about whether that's true or you're just having a go at one of your neighbours. Yeah? And that's something that we will also sometimes pick up. Also, response to negative drug searches is often to take people to the PIC strip search. If you're a black man in a certain area, a young black person in a certain area of Ipswich, and they don't find something on you, then there's a good chance they will take you to the Martlesham for a strip search, which could take several hours. So in that circumstance, is running away from the police a suspicious activity, or I don't want to be strip searched because you haven't found cannabis on me? It's really interesting. Right, so the group's approach, our volunteers, the people who come, they tend to come month after month, but anybody can contribute, and we do welcome people coming in, even if it's just for one meeting. Our focus is about driving change through demanding improvements to supervision, training, and asking for feedback. And I think we have heavily influenced Suffolk Police training on stop and search. It's really interesting that the training that Suffolk Police do now is a lot more bespoke. It certainly doesn't follow the national pattern as I understand it. And I know the work that Roger's been doing very much mimics the way that the Stop and Search Reference Group look at previous stops and searches and analyses them as to whether they're legal or not legal. There has been improvement in legality, but not disproportionality. And I think that's got to do with where you look for something is what you find. So the fact that you're doing your proactive searches in locations where black and minority ethnic people live means you are going to do more stops and searches on black and minority ethnic people. And there has to be a question, particularly given the fact that they're picking up stops and searches for small amounts of evidence. You have to question whether that's a priority or whether other forms of policing are appropriate. So it's really about doing a lot more work on the police priorities. Now, I also run a project called Tackling Discrimination in the East, and we give free legal advice and casework for anybody who's the victim of any form of unlawful discrimination in Suffolk. Now, the police are covered by the duties not to discriminate under the Equality Act, as they're the provider of services to the public, and also under what is known as the public sector equality duty. And we also act as a third-party reporting centre for police complaints and hate crime. And yet there are few complaints about stop and search itself. That's because young people are less likely to complain about anything formally. And stop and search mostly affects young people. If stop and search happened to 50-year-olds, there would be a lot more complaints, because statistically 50-year-olds complain a lot more than young people. But we know that there is discrimination in the work of police, because we've helped with other successful complaints of race discrimination by Suffolk police officers, which shows that the police sometimes do contain some officers with discriminatory attitudes, and those police officers have the power to stop and search. And so it's really important that we get stop searches, complaints for stop search, because that way we can challenge discrimination. One of the things that was suggested to me before by a solicitor, an Actions Against the Police solicitor, is one of the really good reasons is even if you're not successful in your complaint, it shows a pattern by officers, which can often help with regard to the evidence of a particular officer's behaviour and might explain their conduct. So, next steps, and this will be my last slide. We've got to refresh and update the research locally. It's 10 years old now. There are some issues around the demographic information, but really we're not succeeding on disproportionality. We need to go back into the police and find out whether there are new myths or a regurgitation of the old myths. Body-worn video. We are being invited in to go and do body-worn videos. We're not being paid any more money, but that's a recurring pattern of our relationship with Suffolk Police. They like us, but they don't want to pay us very much. But anyway, we've been asked to go in, but they're also requiring those who go in to be fully vetted, and that concerns me, because in practice, if the public scrutiny is only about, sort of nice people, nice middle-aged people like us, rather than people who won't want to be vetted, like young people necessarily wouldn't necessarily want to be vetted, how good is that public scrutiny? So I do question some of the hoops that we have to jump through in order to get to do these sorts of things. The other thing, and it's not really been touched on, is how much is there a link to poor performance in black and minority ethnic recruitment, retention and promotion? Suffolk Police is a very white police force, and I had to email really nice police officer who I got on very well with to mention to her that the latest advert that they put out at the time for a police volunteer was of a white man in his 50s. And I was saying, how is that persuading black people to join the police force as a volunteer or in paid roles? Their recruitment, their retention, their promotion, I think has a lot to do with why disproportionality in stop and search is still happening. Because interestingly enough, I disagreed with you on one point. You said that the police are very embedded in the community. Suffolk Police are embedded in some communities. It's often not the communities who are subject to stop and search. You have not got the Romanian gypsies, the English gypsies and travellers, the people from the Baltic countries, the Africans, the Caribbeans in your police force. So their communities, who are the ones who are subject to stop and search, aren't feeding back in these informal loops that you talk about to have an influence on this policy. And so the link between stop and search and the profile of the police is hugely important. And I think that's going to be a challenge that Suffolk Police will really have to do something about if it's going to tackle its disproportionality. And that's the end of my speech.